So I'm going to try this as a live Google Hangout broadcast. I just tried to record it as a quick capture in Chrome on YouTube, and I don't know if anyone else has this issue, but it never works for me. It always freezes, and I get frustrated because it erases the first 10 minutes of what I was talking about. Anyways, I wanted to respond a little bit to an article that I just read in the June issue of the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. It was written by a religious scholar named Lisa Sedaris, and she was, among other things, in this article critiquing a movement coming out of religious studies that goes under various names: the epic of evolution, the universe story, the journey of the universe. Um, Mary Evelyn Tucker and John Grimm at Yale have a program in religion and ecology. They've published many books, um, sort of drawing upon the world's great religious traditions in order to, um, create a set of values that can help us imagine a new way of life, a new way of living on this planet that is more in harmony with all of the other creatures that call this planet home that don't happen to be human. And more recently, Mary Evelyn Tucker worked with the mathematical cosmologist Brian Swim to produce a movie called The Journey of the Universe, which is, I believe it's on PBS now, and um, it's generally getting a positive reception, and people are excited about it. Now, what Lisa Sedaris is critiquing is the way that um, these approaches to um, the ecological crisis, which in general are coming out of religious studies departments, but Brian Swim is actually a mathematical cosmologist trained as a scientist and taking the scientific story, treating scientific cosmology as a story, and arguing that science has discovered, in fact, that the universe has a kind of narrative structure to it. That you know, inflationary cosmology basically um, is an evolutionary journey, and that human beings can understand this evolutionary process as, in some sense, um, a narrative, as a meaningful story that, with a little bit of imagination, we can situate ourselves within, that we can um, gain meaning from. And, something that many of the proponents of this approach to interpreting scientific knowledge, something that they'll often say is that, we certainly need a myth, but for the first time, thanks to the modern scientific perspective, we can create a true myth. And I think Sedaris is uncomfortable with the idea that the scientific version of events as it exists today um, is really standing on solid enough ground to claim that it is finally the true story, um, thereby invalidating all of the prior cosmological myths that our species has articulated. And even to call them prior is to create this sort of um, hierarchy of truth, um, and they're not really prior. There are still existing, thriving communities on this planet that really don't orient themselves, don't produce meaning by relating themselves to the scientific story. So Sedaris is saying that we need to, instead of looking for some one monolithic story that could encompass all of the Earth's peoples under one sacred canopy, that we need to, as she puts it, allow 1,000 flowers to bloom, and really foster a diversity of interpretations of where humans came from and where we're going. Now, I think I am sympathetic to many of her criticisms. I certainly think that you know, Brian Swim's understanding of science is one that leaves uh, really mystery um, at the heart of this universe. And he's not the type of scientist who believes that one day the scientific method and through mathematical um, and logical reflection that we'll be able to finally describe and explain all of the universe's processes with complete precision and total understanding. I think, he'd be the first to admit that science is an ongoing, open-ended um, procedure, and I think he would admit as well that the version of the story that science has provided us as of now could very well change. But the point is that he would say, I think, that science has um, provided us with a method that allows for widespread consensus and agreement, and it lays the playing field for a collaborative effort to arrive at and indeed construct forms of truth that are, in some ways transcultural. I think that's his argument. And so the idea of a universe story, or the universe story, is based on that sort of idea that science as a method, as a process, tends toward um, convergence, tends toward a sort of, at least, relative universality, in terms of, you know, those who are trained in science, when the evidence is provided to them, they generally have to consent to it. And so Brian and others involved in this movement, and Brian is a teacher of mine here at CIIS, they're putting their faith in the scientific method, and hoping that the wonders of this evolutionary process that scientific method has revealed to us will be enough to wake people up out of the consumerist stupor that Western industrial civilization um, has put them into. And I'm sympathetic to that whole approach. I think Brian's work is very valuable in that respect. I'm also sympathetic to what Sedaris is saying. I have posted many videos about ontological pluralism and the need to recognize that reality at the most fundamental level is multiple, that there in fact are realities rather than one single reality. Um, and it follows from this that there really isn't one unified capital S science. In fact, there are many, many, many disciplines. There are many sciences, and each one of these sciences operates within its own paradigms. It has its own instruments, its own languages, um, you know, and there are a few of these sciences that can, um, you know, overlap and share data in a way that is coherent and makes sense. But overall, there has been only in the last few hundred years an increasing specialization in science. There hasn't been much attention paid to some sort of transdisciplinary, overarching cosmological vision that would hold it all together. And I think Brian and others like him are trying to do that. But the fact of the matter is that science itself, as it is practiced by scientists, is multiple. And so, ontologically speaking, the capital N nature, this uniform manifold of space, time, matter, and energy that physicists say that they study, it's also multiple, because it's not just studied by physicists. Even physics itself is broken up into these various subdisciplines, and there's chemistry, there's biology, and each one of those fields itself has many subdisciplines. And often these subdisciplines arrive at and produce knowledge that is, at the very least, difficult to connect up with other subdisciplines and disciplines, and at worst, it contradicts what other disciplines are saying. So we have really multiple sciences and multiple natures. Each one of these sciences brings forth its own vision of nature or a particular slice of nature. Um, so, that's what is entailed by an ontological pluralism. So, metaphysically speaking, um, I think it's important to acknowledge that we're dealing with not so much a universe as a pluriverse. And, I think this isn't to say that we shouldn't strive for, um, a convergence of our disciplinary understandings. And certainly that sort of transdisciplinary work is really important. And I try to do that myself. Um, but I think in some sense we have to recognize the search for some all encompassing cosmological vision as an ideal, a sort of regulative principle that guides our research. But we should never claim to have finally arrived at that completed picture, because in practice, you know, we're always going to be limited by our own perspectives. And I think the sort of ontological scheme that I'm putting forward, an ontological pluralism, would suggest again that what reality is finally made of is an infinite array of perspectives. There is no world out there independent of these perspectives. Reality itself is perspectival, and is in process. These um, perspectives aren't just static monads. They're constantly interacting and transacting with one another, transforming one another, giving rise to new perspectives that have never existed prior. Um, so again, I think I have sympathy both for this larger cosmological project, this attempt to construct a cosmological narrative, a universe story, and I'm also sympathetic to what Sedaris is arguing, that we need to let a thousand flowers bloom, that we need to really enshrine plurality. And it would make sense in our search, in our pursuit for a more ecologically viable way of life and view of the world, or set of views of the world, that we would really try to encourage diversity. A healthy ecosystem is a diverse ecosystem. And so a knowledge ecology at the level of how human beings and human societies interact, a noetic ecology, if you will, should also be diverse. It should allow a whole variety of different perspectives to flourish. Now, of course, often, and we see this playing out on the world stage right now, there are a variety of perspectives that are in fact incompatible with one another. And there are, human groups that become so fixated on their own ideology that they are willing to kill others or enslave others who refuse to convert or conform to their particular view of the world. So while I think plurality is inevitable and needs to be fostered, I also think there needs to be a sort of attitudinal shift, a shift at the level of our attitudes, or an emotional shift almost, where our capacity for compassion for ourselves and others rises to a point where in any interaction with someone who holds a different perspective to us, has a different story that helps them explain their place in the world and make meaning of their lives. We need to find a way of interacting with them compassionately so that we can learn from them, so that no perspective ever becomes fixed. So, yes, a plurality of perspectives should be fostered, but at the same time, we should also encourage a sense of the ongoing um, process of relating perspectives so that we never allow ourselves to become so attached to our own perspective that we're willing to allow that attachment to override that more foundational sense of compassionate response to the perspective of others, right? So a metaphysics, an ontology, a politics of plurality, yes, but in terms of how we relate psychologically, emotionally, ethically, um, we need a sense of that interconnected, um, you know, web of relations, and to always act from a place of compassion. So, yeah, an ontology of pluralism, but an ethics of compassion, um, which allows us to always remain in ongoing dialogue and conversation with one another rather than allowing plurality to devolve into um, a war of the worlds, so to speak. So that's my 2 cents. I posted some links, or I will post some links in the description of this video to Lisa Sedaris's essay if you can access it. It's a journal you need to pay for. There's also a video of her presenting at a conference about the journey of the universe, and I'll link you to her homepage at her university. So thanks for listening. Curious to hear anyone else's thoughts about this.